It's a third one in a row. Do we do it?
Do it.
Okay, I go father.
Son.
Welcome to Tuhon and Son. In the third episode, where it doesn't sound as crappy as the other two. Moving on up in the world. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was Gamma. So tell me a little bit, before the world was eclipsed with the MMA Ultimate Fighting Championship hysteria, how common was it for one gym or one martial arts training center to have multiple disciplines?
Well, I think it was starting to happen. Quite a few gyms had to become multidisciplinary simply because the idea of having one school with one style or maybe one or two styles was starting to become more difficult to maintain because people, to have a gym with just one thing happening in it only and have it happening so that it could sustain a commercial space, you had to have classes 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. And unless you had an extremely strong teaching style, you probably had a very difficult time keeping those doors open because not only did you want to pay your rent and your electricity and your water bills, but you also wanted to walk home with enough money that you would not starve or go bankrupt. And so unless you were a school that had a really, really marketable style with very, very easy to do things, that's when you started seeing people go and, have black belts for little children. That, is an absurdity. You started seeing people having
and eyes growing up. Every time be like, my brother's a black belt. And we'd be like, yeah, so I'm sure your dad paid a lot for it.
Yeah, well, that's a problem because parents were, after the big seduction of the North American populace in the 70s over martial arts, what happened is that you had people who thought that if their kids had some kind of ranking in martial arts, that in itself would act as a deterrent. So the other kids would leave them alone, or they would be the ones doing the work, doing the attacking, etc. And so you have all these little people who didn't necessarily have any street fighting ability, but they had a black colored piece of cotton around their waist, and they were able to jump up and down and scream and stuff like that. And so what happens is that as those things in the 80s and 90s started falling away, I mean, of course they still exist, but for the most part, a lot of people just got very, very disappointed with things. And then in the late 80s, early 90s, a seed was planted in Los Angeles. I mean, it had been planted in Brazil before that, but this family of Gracies that had developed a system called Brazilian Jiu-jitsu. Some Japanese guy had moved to Brazil at the turn of the 19th century and had been helped by this guy named Gastão Gracie. And in return, he taught the Gracie family jiu-jitsu. And then what happened is that the two sons, I think it was Carlos and Helio, they learned this jiu-jitsu stuff and they really ran with it. They started teaching everybody, all their brothers and all their family. And after quite a few years, they started taking on challenges with everybody. They would basically issue a challenge. It would take anybody on anytime. And they got faced with a lot of challenges. And as the family grew, because, being good Catholic people, they had lots of kids. I think Carlos Gracie had 21 children. Helio.
Wow, that's talking about planting a seed.
He didn't have I think he had more than one wife, but and Helio Gracie, his brother, had not that many children.
I certainly hoped so. He'd have more than one wife. The amount of mileage on natural childbirth is.
Yeah. Well. Anyway, so because they had this natural factory worked out, eventually they went outside the family. There were people outside the family who were learning it all the time, but then they started really teaching it a lot. And then in the 60s and 70s, it got pretty big and pretty popular. And then they were still taking on all challenges. And then as I said, in the late 1980s, a good part of the family moved to Los Angeles, and they started teaching Americans. And they started doing very, very well. There were guys like this guy Hickson Gracie, who was a son of Helio, and they had Hoyler and what was his name? Hoyler, Hoyce. Anyway, the whole family. I'm not going to claim to know everybody's name. They basically moved to Los Angeles, but they issued challenges to everybody. They literally went around saying, they go to local karate school, already karate champion school, and say, we'll take you, we'll beat you anytime we want. And a lot of people just said no, and a lot of people said yes. And then what happened is that they realized that, even though they were winning all these little matches against these American champions, that nothing was really happening. And so Jorge and Gracie, along with a guy named Mark Davies, started putting together the basics of something called the Ultimate Fighting Championships. And they came up with this idea that they would have a guy, and this turned out to be Hoist Gracie, and he wasn't actually the best fighter in the family, but he actually looked like the guy that anybody could beat up, which is why it was so successful. Because if they'd put in Hicks and Gracie, this guy looked like a fighter. So if he won, everybody would go, "So, well, look at him. Oh my gosh, he looks like a fighter." Mm-hmm. But if you have a guy who's a tall, sort of lanky, sort of the last person you'd see as a fighting champion, and he goes out there and he kicks everybody's ass, well, this is something that will make news. And that's basically what happened. So they set it up, and it was in Denver, the first one. I think that was in 93, 94. And all of a sudden, the floodgates exploded. I remember Hoist and Jorge and Gracie came to Montreal, and they had, there's a boxing gym that I had studied at, a place called École de Boxe Sud-Ouest, down in St. Henry. And this place was packed. They borrowed mats from everybody, including my place. They had at least 150 people there, all paying $300 for 2 3-hour days of maybe 4 techniques. Nowadays, if you try getting away with that stuff, you'd be run out of town on a rail. Yeah. But in those days, what they were trying to do is they were trying to go in for the long term. They figured if they would teach 4 techniques and they would return every 6 or 7 months, they could make it go. They wouldn't have to show everything they knew for 10, 15, 20 years. And of course, America being the open framework it was, as soon as that was successful, then everybody else went in and started undercutting them. The length of the seminar never changed much, though. There was always 2 or maybe 3 hours. And these guys would go in there and they would basically hand you your lunch on a plate, and they would be like that. They would just destroy you. They would... Excuse me. They were pretty damn good, and as a result, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu basically came to North America, and then we are all. I remember my first experience meeting somebody who knew it, and we all thought that, well, no, this stuff isn't that good. This can't possibly be that good. This is no way. But basically, it was a transitional situation, because what happened was that yes, Jiu-Jitsu was very good. Was it the ultimate martial art? Not when you know it. When everybody knows it, then the playing field gets leveled again. Everybody kind of knew wrestling. Everybody kind of knew boxing and or Muay Thai and or like a full contact karate style, but they didn't know grappling very well. They especially didn't know submission grappling. Now, there were other submission grappling systems. There was Shuto from Japan, Sambo from Russia. There was an awful lot of submission type grappling, wrestling additive situations, but nothing that had quite the competitive and success rate that was able to be maintained by the guys from Jiu-Jitsu. These guys came in and they handed everybody, their ticket out of town. It was really quite impressive.
So how did you end up bringing it to Canada? Well,
I'm not going to claim that. I brought a couple of black belts to Montreal. Okay. But I definitely was not the guy who brought it into Canada. I was probably one of the first guys to try it. Back in 1990, my friend Mark Denny and actually my wife Ruth went out for breakfast in Hermosa Beach. We were down there visiting. Mark asked me if I'd like to accompany him to a private jiu-jitsu class he was having with Higan Machado, one of the cousins of the Gracies.
Just interject, by the time we actually do post the interview we did with Mark Denny, these stories will be like a Marvel comic book,
Okay.
It'll be cool. No, but tell this story, and then they can hear that. Then you can hear from this horse's mouth and that horse's mouth. And there's a bunch of horses talking and collect all the issues.
Anyway, yeah. I was introduced to Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu by Mark Denny in 1990 or 91, maybe 92, and I went over to Higan Machado's house with him to watch him take a private jiu-jitsu class that he was taking at that time. And things were really great. So I came down, and about half an hour I was watching Mark, go through his stuff. It was this really nice sunny morning. The Machado's household was this. All the brothers were living in the same house at the same time. So you could just imagine there was a lot of people in there, and they hadn't quite developed their financial base that they have now. And they had a large backyard, and it was really good because they had these little stage areas were set up and all matted. So all the people that came over there could have a group or a private class, and they were quite a little factory. Anyway, halfway through the lesson, Mark decided to tell me that he was feeling a little tired and would I like to step in? And there's a couple of photographs of this event of me getting twisted into a pretzel-like shape by Higan Machado, who, I didn't even know where to begin to understand.
We'll put the picture, we'll try to find one and we'll literally put it.
Oh, yeah. Well, I know there is a picture of me getting, twisted around by Higan Machado, as I said. But, in those days, it didn't seem like such a big deal because who's this? And now all of a sudden he's somebody special. Anyway, so what happened was that I said, wow, this stuff's great. And then, of course, mini conversations, would you like to bring it to Canada? And it's like, it's like, oh, well, yeah, sure, okay. Johnny's got a barn, we can have a show, that kind of stupid stuff. So I came back and I started talking to people around here about jiu-jitsu. And everybody had the same answer. Oh, arm bars, yeah, we have that. I know, but it's, and I would say, oh, yeah, that stuff. Yeah, those triangles, yeah, we have that. And basically what happened is that it was as if I was, what is it called? It was like sowing wheat on rocks. There was no takers. Nobody was even the slightest bit interested because even though there's a strong jiu-jitsu component in this area, it was very, very resistant to any kind of modern learning. Not any more than if somebody came to my school now and said, hey, I've got this really, really good style of Cali that actually works. And then we're allowed to say to ourselves, our stuff already works.
Yeah. So we fear change.
Well, everybody fears change.
I wonder if that's how the guy who invented the wheel felt. They're like, we like square.
We like dragging our stuff.
Yeah. So what you're saying, like, it's just like, guys, I went through the wardrobe and I met a talking lion and a witch. And they're like, sure. And then the rest of the brothers and sisters eventually would go through. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry.
Well, exactly. But even then, I wasn't sitting there feeling bad or anything. I just went, well, I tried because I didn't really do anything more than that half hour of pretzel making that it wasn't really a class. I had no idea. And it wasn't until much later that I actually participated in it. But this was, as I said, 92. This was a couple of years before the advent of the UFC. And so it didn't really matter. There was nobody, there was no waiting crowd to convince. They all thought that they knew. We all think we all know everything. If somebody comes and says, hey, there's just down the street, there's a guy selling magic beans. Yeah, sure. Anyway, so that was my first experience in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And this is why it did not successfully get planted in Canada earlier than anywhere else. The funny thing is, I was teaching at a place called Green Avenue Community Center, and a Brazilian sailor came in who I remember having a blue belt around his uniform, and what he was looking to do was basically come in and beat people up. I guess, well, when I say beat that, he would, hey, would you like to do some jiu-jitsu? And I didn't know what he was doing. I didn't know that he had as I said, my familiarity with Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu was very limited. And I hadn't heard about it, didn't know anything about it. And so there was no sense of, wonder or, curiosity. Earlier on in 1966, there was a magazine article about capoeira. So when I finally got to do some capoeira, I was extremely surprised how much more difficult it was because it seemed so easy when the guys were doing their flips in the books. Yeah. Anyway. We'll
get on to capoeira in a little bit.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. But anyway, so the jiu-jitsu thing was that, then jiu-jitsu came to North America via the UFC. Everybody just realized at that time that there was a major component because there were a lot of people with wrestling, there were a lot of people with striking, but the submission component was sadly lacking in sophistication. I would say that what happened is that in the time between then and now, and even then, that's about 20 years now that the UFC has actually been around. Since 1994 or 20 years, 2014. So it's been a full lifetime for some people to have gone and learned this stuff. So what really is amazing to me is the fact that we actually have adapted this stuff. It is available in every city, on every street corner. In Montreal now, maybe there's half a dozen, maybe a dozen certified. Actually, no, there's probably more than that. I'm thinking of schools. There are probably more than a dozen or 2 dozen black belts in Montreal. I mean, and not fake little ones that would do very well. That the guy.
You used to have to import them.
I used to have to import them, and now they're available locally at your local jiu-jitsu greengrocer.
Yeah. Okay, so tell us more about capoeira then. Like maybe this episode could be called Phil Jelena Goes Brazilian. Or Gets Brazilian.
Takes a Brazilian of them. How many is that anyway?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Revenge of the Pretzel.
Well, the jiu-jitsu thing actually has kind of a similar train of thought to the capoeira thing, because I guess around the same time, the 1990s, early 1990s, one of my old students, a guy by the name of Stefan Kesting, who now lives in Vancouver and is the proud owner of a jiu-jitsu black belt under Marcus Suarez, and he runs something called grapplearts.com, a really incredible website. He was...
That was a fine plug, Father.
Anyway, he came to me and asked me if he was interested in pursuing capoeira. And I'd known about capoeira, as I said, since the 60s. I'd been reading about different articles, and I had never studied it, but I had some idea of it. And a guy that I knew, who I will remain nameless, claimed to have some connection to it. And he was telling me, I knew capoeira. And if you heard him talk, you would think this guy had spent maybe years doing it. Mm-hmm. And so I was very happy about that. So I sent Stefan over, and Stefan came back to me and said, doesn't really know anything. Well, I was not either surprised or shocked or anything. I just said, told me that he did. So what happened, in around the same time, there was a traveling troupe of Brazilian folklore players that came to Montreal.
Well, define folklore player.
People who like flamenco dancers going around and dancing.
Okay, because I wasn't sure if it was like a Brazilian equivalent to Lord of the Rings.
No. It's a folklorico. Capoeira was considered like the folklore of Brazil. Mm-hmm. And they would do samba dancing, how Carnival in Rio de Janeiro, they'd have all these people with these huge dresses. And so capoeira became part of that. So they would go around and they would have a troupe of dancers doing capoeira type of choreography and all these other choreographies. This gentleman by the name of Giba Gonzalez had done some capoeira. And so he came and he stuck around for a while. He showed us, we did a bunch of classes. But they were more dance classes than really capoeira classes. But when you don't have anything, whatever you have is okay. One of my really good friends, Marilyn Lalonde, with whom I trained in the 60s and early 70s.
She didn't kick you in the face with a ballet slipper.
No, she didn't. Okay. No.
Okay.
Anyway, Marilyn went down. I also knew Shiva. Shiva had received an invitation to go to a batizado. A batizado is a big, like a meeting of capoeiristas. One school will have a batizado, which will be a graduation ceremony of all these people going to the next string, because they didn't wear belts, they wore strings around their waist. And Shiva received an invitation, and he didn't want to go, or couldn't go, or something like that, but she definitely did want to go. So she got on a plane, went down, spent a week there, taking classes, meeting people. And she met a guy by the name of Doraldo Fierro, who was based in Brazil, or not based in Brazil, he was based in Boston. And he was very interested in expanding his group. And so very soon after, he came up and started coming to Montreal. And this was in about 1990, I guess. Yeah, maybe 1990. Mm-hmm. And he started coming up to Montreal. And it was quite amazing because we learned all sorts of stuff. I mean, quite honestly, I was 40 years old at the time. 40 years old is not the time to start doing capoeira.
Yeah, capoeira, for those of you who don't know, what would you say it is? Kind of like breakdancing?
Well, actually, breakdancing owes its root to capoeira. So, yeah, there's a very definite connection between
And there's that movie, Only the Strong, with Mark Dacascos.
Who's also a Kajikembo guy.
Who's a Kajikembo guy who knew a little bit of enough of capoeira to make a movie about it.
Yeah, he got to stand on.
But he had skill.
Yeah, well, he was a gymnast at university as well. Yeah. So that's a very strong component in capoeira. Anyway, capoeira started developing very strongly, and we in Montreal in our group we had 3 or 4 batizados. We had them in large halls. We would sell tickets. We would bring people from Brazil and New York and Los Angeles and San Francisco. I mean, these mestres would come up. I mean, basically the way it would work is that a mestre would come up. You'd kind of pay for his way up. But the way he would make his money is that he would teach workshops. And so each workshop would cost a bit. And so that's how they would make their money. And so if you were extremely dynamic and wished to work a lot, you could do quite well. And if you had a reputation, you could also, they would bring out their berimbau, which are the stringed instruments that go, when you hear jong, 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 jong.
I think that music was actually featured in a couple commercials since then, actually.
Yeah, there's a Mazda commercial.
Yeah.
Zoom, 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 capoeira, mata zoom. But they now say that it was a Mazda song, but it was actually an old capoeira song.
Yeah.
I guess that's what happens when you take a folklore.
Yeah.
You can steal it.
Yeah, the berimbau and stuff like that. Like I think that was a couple of times we'll have to do a special episode about the times I almost did that many martial arts. But capoeira was definitely one of them. And
well, Ryan, you were the very first young man to be belted in capoeira in Canada. There were a lot of people who were doing it, but you were there at the very beginning. And
and I was very, very young.
Yeah.
Dad's selling point was it's what the Power Rangers do.
Well, they were. I mean, that guy Sonny Sisson that we met, he was.
Yeah, he was Jason David Frank's stunt double.
Yeah.
Hence Tommy the white/green/red/whatever Ranger, and
it's funny because he's now he's still a stuntman, but I'm on Facebook with him. He's a stuntman and a Filipino martial artist as well.
You know what? Let's get him on Skype and let's interview him. And I'm just gonna dork out. I'm gonna be like, and then when you kick the buddy in the face, and then or like the Chris Farley show. That was awesome. But okay, so all right, so that's how capoeira came and stuff like that. So you've done a lot for the Brazilians in Canada here, sir. Like especially in Montreal. Like what was it like bringing this over? Like was it constantly like, no guys, it's good. Trust me. I don't know. And
well, no, I think, but if you love something, and it really doesn't matter how you manifest it, but if you really like doing something, if it is a certain martial art or anything that you like doing, there's a reason why you were attracted to it. It's not like, oh, well, I was attracted to it. Well, why were you attracted to it? Because it had green bells, and it's not that at all. I mean, there's something intrinsically beautiful about capoeira. I mean, I can't sing. I definitely can't dance very well, but it didn't bother me. I mean, I would sing as well as I could. I mean, yes, people who could sing and could play musical instruments were far better and got farther on it than I ever did. But I don't feel as if I was in any way, negatively impacted by it. It was kind of funny because Doraldo, when we were being told we were going to be passing certain levels, I mean, I was only in it for about 3 years. I had to stop because, as I said, I began at 40, and I guess 2 or 3 years later, I was doing a class, and one of the things you do at the end of class, you do something called a roda, spelled R-O-D-A, because if you're a carioca, which is a person from the Rio de Janeiro area, you talk like this. Hey, Connie. Hey, my name is Doraldo. Hey, Carl, it's very nice to see you today. And so that way, that's a karaoke accent. And so they pronounce their R's as H. Ergo, whenever you speak to somebody from Brazil who speaks to, if you were to look at Rickson Gracie, you would call him Hickson. Royce Gracie would be Hoyce. And et cetera, et cetera. All the R's are H's.
What the hell does this have to do with it?
Well, no, I'm just saying that's why it's called a roda and not a roda.
Okay.
Anyway, so but the roda is the game that you play. You do the footwork and you do the cartwheels and you do the acrobatic-y kicks, and that's the roda. And then that is played and controlled by the guy at the head with his berimbau, that little distinct-ringed instrument. And there's a lot of singing and dancing, and it's a really kind of pleasant time. Anyway, so...
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's kind of like, like in the Karate Kid with the Cobra Kai, like, and all the Cobra Kai were a bunch of jerks. It's hard to imagine a bunch of people being a bunch of jerks doing Hoda, you know?
Yeah, well,
It's like, oh, that was a good Hoda. Hey, there's that Danielson kid. Let's go beat him up. Yeah.
let's do an AU then.
Yeah, it seems like a good time. Well, it was a good time.
Let's mail to kick his ass.
It was a good time. I recall, like 2 decades ago. Yeah.
Yeah, well, no, it was very impressive to me to see the stuff that we did because it was great exercise, for whatever that means. There's a lot of camaraderie that came into that, and I think more than anything else, you started learning stuff. I mean, there's real demands were put on you, and you start realizing how in smaller communities. Information isn't transferred because sometimes when you go to in a large city, say, okay, we're gonna have a class on plumbing. So you get a bunch of guys show up, or guys, men and women show up in a room, and some guy at the front is going, "Hey, I'm Joe the plumber, and I'm going to show you about plumbing. And here's a 2-inch pipe, and a 2-inch pipe goes to here, and you never put it into this thing or that thing, but you always got to use it for this stuff." And so he tells you all the rules. Whereas if it's a smaller thing, like a father to son or small apprentice to master situation, basically he's there. He shows you how to do stuff, and that's kind of how the capoeira people do it. The capoeiristas, the teacher sort of goes into a cartwheel called an AU, and you follow.
Yeah.
And so he gets his thing happening, and he gets to work out, and then you have to work out. And eventually, as you learn more techniques or more movements, then you have to deal with other people. And so you have to something called a meio de compasso, which is kind of like a swinging hook kick with your one hand touching the ground. And these are little techniques that you practice, and you need to have somebody else there. Otherwise, you won't have the timing. And so that's the whole thing. You start realizing what you're doing. And then as you play in the Hoda, the jogo de capoeira, then you would practice your techniques. And so, even to this day, there's songs that I remember, which is frightening.
Yeah, I do too. A lot of them, actually.
It was always so funny for us. When you'd hear that Barenbow song, and at first I heard that Mazda commercial, zoom, 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 and
you're like, ow, my back.
Yeah, right. No. And it was funny because the very first time we did capoeira, what happens is your muscles go into a shutdown after a certain point of time. I mean, like if you run a lot,
yeah. Especially if you don't train, like it's like the idea where if you run a marathon and you're not used to running long distance, by the time you sit down, all of a sudden your body will shut down. If you
and that's if you're able to make the marathon.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, let's say 15 miles or so into your 26-mile journey, your legs literally, if you're not ready for it, you have no glycogen left in your muscles, and you stop. You cannot move. Well, what happens when you do a bunch of cartwheels?
At 40.
At 40, or well, I wasn't the only person this happened to.
Married with children as well.
Yeah, so we would do these AUs, and we'd sort of stop in the middle of the AU and halfway through the cartwheel, kind of show control. And then your arms and shoulders would give up, and you would crash your head onto the floor, and you had nothing. I mean, because if you're on your handstand and you would stop yourself from hitting the floor, it's because you had something left in your arms to flex.
Yeah.
But there's nothing left. So crash. And my wife, who was sitting up on a raised platform, was laughing her guts out. And, there were, of course, lots of people who took it like a duck to water, but people like me had to work very hard to go nowhere.
Yeah. And I don't know if this has ever been officially confirmed, but there's a character in the Street Fighter 2 franchise that's this crazy Brazilian type of monster character that lives in a jungle or something named Blanca. And you mentioned when I was playing it as a kid, you were mentioning, oh yeah, that looks a lot like capoeira because all he was doing is a bunch of flips and kicks, and so I don't know if it's modeled after it exactly, but definitely maybe inspired by it.
Well, absolutely, because the guys in the movie/video game industry are, they learn about cutting edge things simply because they want to be the first ones on the block to know it.
Yeah. And so a little bit more about jiu-jitsu, I guess, considering this is called Phil Kelman Goes Brazilian. So after being twisted pretzels and you started bringing black belts to town to learn and stuff like that, was it catching on quicker?
Well, the first Brazilian that we had in Montreal was a guy by the name of Wagner Fabiano. He came to town to visit a guy actually who was teaching capoeira. And this guy had sort of made an empty promise to Wagner that if you come up, we'll start a school together. And Wagner had just received his black belt and finished third place in the World Championships in Brazil in 1998. And he came and visited me, and he spoke no English.
I remember.
And so we were talking
That
to
didn't
each other.
stop him from talking to me for 20 minutes at a time, though. But very, no, as far as I remember, friendly fellow.
Very friendly fellow. Anyway, but I had my school, and we were renting half a floor of the space we are sort of using now, and there was a half a floor available because when we moved in, there were all these people that were moving out. I guess they had just basically said, we have to renovate, we have to revamp.
Was this Gamma at this point, or was this just?
This was Gamma. This is.
Okay.
It wasn't called Gamma. That took we were just.
All right, that'll be another episode.
Well, yeah,
to build a gym, that'll be another episode.
Well, this is a sort of a gym thing, but I mean, it was just that we called it Gamma later. We just started realizing that I'd actually called it l'Académie d'Arts Martiaux Culturels, Jalina, because I thought to myself, well, if we ever need to make an application for a grant for anything, it always sounds much better when you're sounding as if you're culturally included.
Yeah.
So we called ourselves that. And so eventually we realized that that was way too long to say on the phone every time you answered it. And so we eventually realized that Gamma was the name to call it.
Okay.
Anyway, so the Brazilian guy was there. And when he started coming in, then the information, we had a small space, maybe 1,000 square feet. But we had a lot of people who came very, very quickly to train with us. George St. Pierre. His guy named Christophe Midou, who was his first jiu-jitsu coach, brought him to our school. And George started getting his Brazilian jiu-jitsu from us because we were the only place in town that had a black belt. And we were the go-to guys. We didn't really push it that much. I mean, George in those days wasn't what he became. I think it was only a year or so later that the UFC actually even started. Not the UFC, the UCC. The UCC was the Montreal promotion. Anyway, it was, there was a lot of stuff in there. So these guys would come into our gym and, they were lined up, not around the block, but there were quite a few people, a lot of the early trainers. And then about 2000, Wagner moved to Toronto. I found out about that on the internet. I was reading the internet and I read something about some guy, Wagner was visiting his friends or family in Brazil. And I read this thing saying, hey, in February, Wagner's moving to Toronto to run their school. So I was sort of like, so I saw Wagner came back, and I wish I knew basically how to shut somebody down. Not him necessarily, but it would have been nice to know how to tell people that, or to have some kind of legal standing, so that if people sort of jerk you around that way, that you can say, well, gosh, it's been really nice knowing you. I'll see you. And you don't have a work permit anymore because they're there because you're being the right person for them. And when people decide that, that they want to leave, they should actually come to you and, and discuss this stuff with you so that you can make it work for both of you and not just, leave with a bunch of nothing's left but the crying. Mm-hmm. But that's, that's, as you say, that's another story for another day. But these guys came in there, and then after that, about 2003, we were visited,
by Three Spirits.
Yeah, by Three Spirits, no. We were visited by a guy named Fabio Holanda. And Fabio Holanda was a member of the Brazilian top team. He had also finished in the top 3 of the World Championships. And his brother was going to the University of Montreal. And he came, and his brother called me up and asked me if I would be interested in having a seminar with him. And I said, yeah, okay, because he was basically in town shopping himself around. He was trying to figure out a place because he knew that as much of a Brazilian as he was, there was little, if any, chance of you making any real money in Brazil because, A, there wasn't that much there. Not that there's no money, but if you're a rich guy in Brazil, you're probably not doing jiu-jitsu, at least not to teach. You're doing it to practice it. And if you and if your name is not Gracie, the chances of you being able to make a real living by the 1998, everybody had already established their position in Brazil. So the guys who were good, were already good. The guys who weren't so good, they had never had a chance. And so the only real chance for these guys to make a living doing what they did would be to move out into greener pastures like Canada and the U.S. I suspect that he came up and he was with me for about 5 years, and that's when we worked a lot with a lot of UFC fighters that fought, that came from Montreal. A lot of them. Like George was with us when he won the world championship.
Yeah, and Chuck Liddell passed by.
Yeah, Chuck Liddell came by. Well, that was not for the jiu-jitsu. He came by because we had a gym, and he's a Kajukenbo guy as well.
Cool.
And we had learned that he'd there. But we also had Marco Rua.
Didn't we have Shogun or something?
Yeah, that's Marco Rua.
Okay, yeah. I met a guy, and I think my best friend Jason came in the office later, and he's just like, dude, was that Shogun? And I'm like, what's a Shogun? I barely know anything about UFC and stuff. Actually, somebody who used to frequent our gym a lot was an actor named Sean Patrick Flanery, who you will out there know as one of the brothers in the Boondock Saints. He's been in many movies, including Saw 1.
And he's now a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt.
Yeah, and he gives seminars and stuff. So he was giving a seminar after his appearance at the Ottawa Comic-Con.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was doing a seminar the next day, so.
Do you know where?
I do not know.
Okay.
But I wish I would have gone and bothered him with questions about the Boondock Saints. He's actually the actor in a movie I didn't realize he was in called Powder. Mm-hmm. And that movie's haunted me for years because that's my nickname because of Mom's ghostly ginger complexion that I inherited her skin but not her hair. Yeah, that name has haunted me for years and decades. So it was interesting to meet the original Powder. All right, Dad. So do you think there's a martial art out there you haven't heard of yet that you would probably be curious if you weren't your age? And if,
Well, probably. I mean, the curiosity never dwindles. The reality. I mean, like the one reality that I know I am not 18 anymore.
Yeah.
I am very painfully aware of that. I do as much as I can to keep myself in some semblance of shape. I run on a treadmill. I try and do kettlebells. I try and do things. But just there's certain parts of your body that, you're genetically gifted to last a long time. I mean, we're like cars. Some of us will last a long time and will look great in a museum in 100 years. Other ones will be rusted hulks on the side of the road that they should just pull off and crumple up and send off to some other place. So
that's the most depressing thing I've ever heard.
Well, when it comes to physicality, I mean, some people don't care about physicality, but I mean, I'm very happy that I've arrived at this age. I'm 61, and I'm happy to have arrived at this age without having sustained an awful lot of horrendous injuries.
With the exception of the ballerina slipper from the last chapter.
But that was my eyelid was hanging down, but that wasn't. I mean, it's not like my Achilles tendon was torn.
That's true. You can't blame actual martial arts for this.
No. But at 61, your body just, it's sometimes you wake up and you feel great, and sometimes you wake up and you kind of crawl everywhere for the first 2 hours until everything warms up. And so, yes, there's a lot of martial arts out there that I would love to be able to do. But at the same time, I'm satisfied with being able to practice the ones I do. So
yeah. So any message to anybody out there who they're 18 and they might hear of a weird martial art, and people will say, "But we already have that." What would you say to them now?
Well, it's if something about it strikes a chord, and you are able to justify to yourself the reality of wanting to do it, then you should do it. And you should never apologize or explain or anything like that. But, if there is something weird and the only thing about it that you're attracted to is the fact that, you'll be able to shoot Dragon Balls out of your hands, like that guy in Dragon Ball Z, then run as far away as you can. Because there's an awful lot of charlatans out there.
All right, and that was another episode of Tuhon and Son. For more information on Philip Jelna and his Martial Arts Academy Gamma, go to MontrealMartialArts.com.
It's the one.
Yep. All right. I'm Ryan Shalna,
And I'm Philip Jelena.
and this has been Tuhon Son. Thank you very much for listening. We're on Spreaker right now, and you can download our first 4 episodes for a limited time because, well, there's only so much space they allow you to upload for free, and frankly, yeah. All right.
All right.
All right.